Hi there. My name is Ian Tizard, and I'm the university professor of immunology at Texas A&M University. My prime interest is in veterinary immunology, the science of resistance of animals, domestic animals, to infectious agents. This is a critical subject for veterinarians because infectious diseases have affected humans, their pets, and livestock for thousands of years, and they have to be controlled. So, immunology is the science of the defense of the body. We live in a microbial environment. There are bacteria everywhere. Viruses are all around us, and there's plenty of other potential invaders as well. The list here shows quite a diversity, and the immune system has to defend us against every one of these. So it's not surprising that it's complex. It takes different mechanisms to handle different invaders. When we look at the immune system, we can divide it into three basic components: physical barriers, innate immunity, and adaptive immunity. And one way to think of this is the fact that the defense of the body is absolutely critical to survival, to human survival, animal survival. And you can't rely on a single mechanism to protect us against everything. So it's complicated. When we look specifically at the domestic animals, what we find is, of course, we have a great diversity of species. We've got dogs and cats, companion animals. We have livestock, cattle and sheep, horses. We've got pigs. And increasingly, we have aquaculture and poultry. We won't talk about fish and poultry today. But each of these species has to have an effective immune system if it is to survive. And the important thing to remember is that these immune systems differ in major respects from the immune systems of mice and humans. This is important because while most immunology research is undertaken in mice and humans, they do not necessarily apply to domestic animal species. Likewise, we use a lot of vaccines in veterinary medicine. And their motivation may be economic because, after all, many forms of livestock, vaccines are necessary to keep the animals alive. Or, of course, in the case of our pets and companion animals, it's compassionate use. Likewise, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, is that animals, like humans, suffer from immunological diseases. They suffer from allergies and autoimmune diseases. Let's first talk about innate immunity. One way to look at innate immunity and the role of innate immunity and way the immune system works is you can think of it as three barriers, one after the other. An invader therefore has to climb the first barrier, which are the physical barriers like tough skin. Then it has to overcome innate immunity. And finally, once it overcomes innate immunity, you have the adaptive immune response, the third arm of the immune response, and by far the most important. And these three types of immunity work at different stages in the defense of the body. What is it? Well, innate immunity is something that every animal has, and it's an immediate stereotypical response to invasion of the body by an infectious agent. Everything has it, all living creatures have it, invertebrates have it, plants have it, and its major component is inflammation. Now, you all know what inflammation is. It's that redness and swelling associated with infected wounds. This is primarily mediated by cells, and we'll talk a bit more about them later. But it also consists of the body's production of many molecules that will kill bacteria and viruses. It's what we call humoral immunity. And its big problem is that it doesn't get any better with time, and it can be potentially damaging. For example, the physical barriers essentially stop things getting in, right? They work at the very beginning. If you can keep the invader out, then you don't have to worry about it. Innate immunity occurs quite quickly, within a few hours. If you hurt yourself, inflammation starts within an hour or two and essentially fills the gap until adaptive immunity takes over. Adaptive immunity takes perhaps several days to develop. And as a result, something has to fill that gap and keep the invaders under control before the adaptive immune system steps in. Here's another way of looking at innate immunity. You can see that it's got two branches. On one side, we have the cells. On the other side, we have the so-called humoral immunity. And we have a list here on each side, on the cellular side, of the many different cell types that are involved in defense. We'll talk more about them later. And likewise, on the humoral side, we have a list of the many molecules that are involved in controlling microbial infection. And the net response is these come together to give a nonspecific, immediate response that, as I say, is stereotypical. It doesn't get better with time, but it keeps the invaders at bay and it ensures that the animal has time to mount a proper adaptive response. Innate immunity is triggered by two things: invading microbes and damaged cells and tissues. Well, we call them PAMPs and DAMPs. PAMPs is an acronym for pathogen-associated molecular patterns, and it simply reflects the molecules that are commonly found on invading microbes, on pathogens, and that the innate immune system can recognize as a sort of general, oops, we are under attack. DAMPs, or damage-associated molecular patterns, reflects the fact that the innate system detects broken cells. It detects the molecules released when cells are damaged. So innate immunity is triggered by the presence of microbes and the occurrence of tissue damage. These PAMPs and DAMPs are recognized by pattern recognition receptors, receptors that can detect cell damage and microbial invasion. And the most important of these are called the toll-like receptors, or TLRs. Toll-like receptors are a family of cellular receptors that can pick up and detect invasion. And binding of microbial factors and broken tissues to these toll-like receptors triggers the release of inflammatory mediators and triggers the whole process of inflammation. This diagram shows where toll-like receptors are located. If they are going to detect invading bacteria, they have to be found on the outside of cells. And you can see receptors 1, 2, 4, 5, and some other receptors, antifungal receptors, are found on the cell surface. On the other hand, other invaders, such as viruses, live inside cells. They need toll-like receptors in their intracellular compartments, where they pick up basically the nucleic acids of the viruses, detect them, and again trigger an inflammatory response. The binding of TLRs triggers the production of molecules that cause inflammation. It activates protective white cells, leukocytes, and it produces defensive molecules, which the most important are molecules called interleukin-1 and the interferons. This diagram simply reflects the many activities of this key molecule, interleukin-1. It's produced by cells such as macrophages. It affects metabolism. It affects blood flow. It affects cell growth. It affects the brain, and we'll come back to that later. It kills some tumor cells. It affects white cells. And most importantly, it triggers inflammation. What leukocytes are activated? Well, different cells are required for different jobs, and which cells are activated depends on which TLRs are triggered. The most important of these cells are neutrophils and macrophages that fight bacteria, lymphocytes that fight viruses, eosinophils fight worms, and basophils, whose job we really don't know, but one thing we do know is that they fight ticks. When a tick bites an animal, basophils seem to converge on the site of the bite. All these cells, these defensive cells, every one of them is produced in the bone marrow. The bone marrow is the source of them, and they differentiate, arise from stem cells in the bone marrow, and by progressive differentiation, form all these white cell types. Let's talk about neutrophils. Neutrophils are the predominant white blood cell or leukocyte in humans, but not necessarily in the domestic animal species. They're sometimes a fairly minor component in animals like cattle. Here's a diagram showing what it looks like Essentially, these are cells that are full of granules that don't really stain very much, so that's why they're called neutrophils, and a very complicated, dense nucleus. And as I say, their prime job is to eat bacteria. Here are 3 photo micrographs showing typical neutrophils in some of the domestic animal species. You can see the cell in the center of each figure is rather palely staining, which means it's a neutrophil. It has an irregular, highly irregular nucleus, but the bottom line is they all look pretty much the same. And the same would apply to humans as well. So all the mammals have similar cells like these neutrophils. Neutrophils eat bacteria. They are attracted to invading bacteria by a process called chemotaxis. They bind to those bacteria, they ingest those bacteria, and they kill them, right? They digest them, get rid of them. So when bacteria invade the body, essentially neutrophils swarm in large numbers to the sites of microbial invasion. This is a scanning electron micrograph from the milk of a cow that had an infection of the udder. And you can see that the cell in the center here is actually taking in this chain of bacteria. They're called streptococci. And so they are being eaten and destroyed by this cell. One of the ways in which neutrophils kill invaders is they produce antibacterial peptides. Right? These are small proteins that act like detergents and break up bacterial walls, molecules that are called defensins or cathelicidins. And animals produce huge quantities of these molecules in the intestine, in your lungs and airways, and on your skin. And they are critical for antibacterial defense. They're produced by all the domestic animal species. Neutrophils by themselves can't handle the job completely. Remember, elimination of invading microbes, 99% isn't enough. You got to get rid of them all. So there's a backup cell called macrophages. These are slower moving cells, but they're much more potent than neutrophils in killing invaders. Here's a picture of a macrophage, in this case, also from the blood of a cow. And you can see it's sort of fairly unimpressive little cell, but lots of vacuoles in its cytoplasm. And this is the secret to its success. But it contains lots of enzymes and lots of molecules that are going to kill invaders. Here's a diagram showing the structure of a typical macrophage with its bean-shaped nucleus, and it's got vesicles in its cytoplasm, it's got ribosomes, it can make protein, a very typical cell. When they were discovered over 100 years ago, pathologists gave macrophages different names depending on their location. In the brain, they called them microglial cells. In connective tissue, they called them histiocytes. In the lung, they called them alveolar macrophages. In the liver, they called them Kupffer cells. They are, in fact, all the same type cell. They are all macrophages, simply scattered strategically through the body, ready to attack and destroy any invaders they encounter. When these cells attack invaders, they trigger inflammation. Like all fights, it's messy, it's destructive, doesn't get better with time. Think about when you go to the chemist shop and look at the aisles where there's all those anti-inflammatory drugs, right? Inflammation is uncomfortable, and it's clearly not a long-term solution to the defense of the body. What we really need is a smart system that doesn't destroy tissues, that is highly competent, and most importantly, highly reliable. Before we leave innate immunity, however, I want to make a comment about sickness. When we get sick, various things happen. We develop a fever, we maybe get tired, we want to go to bed, go off our food. If it happens long enough and for long enough, we get weight loss, we get aches and pains. What's all that about? Well, in fact, sickness is a reflection of innate immunity. It reflects the body's fight against invaders. Why do we develop a fever? Because things work better when they're hotter. The immune system works better. Why are we tired and want to sleep? Because it saves energy that can be used to fight the invader. It's not clear why we stop eating, but it seems to be beneficial. But we certainly may lose weight over a long time simply because energy is being redirected to the innate immune system. And all these things are mediated, in fact, by interleukin 1, the molecule I mentioned earlier that is produced when toll-like receptors are stimulated. So when you feel sick, essentially that is your body fighting off the invader. Now, this is, of course, a key indicator for veterinary care. When do people take their pets to the vets? It's when they see them being sick, it's when they see them being depressed. So, this is a critical marker from a clinical point of view that an individual is infected or has sickness and is mounting an innate immune response. But it all has a purpose, and that is to redirect the resources of the animal body to its defenses. So when you get sick, take it easy, don't fight it because it's important for your health.